Diets and workouts, you've done the work, so why can't you get to your goal weight? That's because up to 70% of your weight is predetermined by your genetics. So while you've been told that it's all about your willpower, you're actually fighting your biology. Don't do it alone. Found's Doctor Design program uses medication as part of a treatment plan that targets your body's unique biological needs, so that your body works with you and not against you. Take the quiz at joinfound.com to see if Found's weight loss program is right for you.
The following is a GoPowerCat.com and Spirit Street production. You've discovered your link to GoPowerCat.com's Powercat Recruiting Podcast, presented by 24/7 Sports. And it starts right now. Now, let's go to the WTC Gig-Powered Studios. Here are your hosts, GoPowerCat.com publisher Tim Fitzgerald and GoPowerCat.com's Ryan Wallace.
Welcome to a special edition of the Powercat Podcast. Signing day is Wednesday for the Kansas State football program and all football programs. We thought we'd sneak you a preview podcast tonight before signing day arrives in the morning and all hell breaks loose. Tim Fitzgerald in the WTC Gig-Powered Studios and our recruiting editor, chief analyst, and recruiting whiz, Ryan Wallace with me. Wally, this early signing period's kind of changed everything, hasn't it? This is really the day now as opposed to this being in February, and this old dog is still adjusting.
I think I saw something from the main account for the 24/7 on Twitter earlier this week, post something along the lines that 80% of the prospects that prospects that they're aware of on the national landscape are expected to sign on Wednesday, which is just insane. It really has taken away some of the luster that February had. And to a certain extent, it kind of loses a lot of that kind of one-day drama. But in a sense, we're getting a lot of that drama, at least for teams not named K-State. We'll get that drama now in December instead of February. But, again, thanks to the job that Chris Klieman's staff did early on, particularly back in June, May, June, and really before the season began, they kind of get to kick their feet up and relax for the majority of Wednesday, because I think it's going to be, for most of the folks in Manhattan, pretty drama-free.
Yeah, they really roared out of the gates and got a lot of commitments. You can only have 25 in a class. I think K-State had some that they can count back into last year's class, guys that would arrive in January. If you've got some spaces, you can count back. They'll hang on to a few for the late signing period. They'll just hang on to a few, period. Maybe they'll get another senior transfer. Gilbert and Brown certainly worked out in the backfield. Maybe there's a position they're on hold with. And they have been reluctant to go the junior college route. It's not where they want to go, but they have done so as of late. They've probably gotten, I would guess, a few more guys. What are they up to, 4 from the JUCO ranks?
Yeah, that's correct.
And they just, as we sat down to do this podcast, got number 4, and a little bit earlier picked up number 3. A couple defensive linemen have joined the Wildcats. Break those guys down.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, they started with Robert Hentz, who's another defensive tackle, and then also got Dawson Delforge, offensive lineman from Butler County. And they were sitting with those two up until early signing period eve on Tuesday afternoon, when they were able to get another Butler County lineman on the defensive side of the ball. That's Derek Newton. And, there wasn't a lot of excitement around his commitment. And I don't want to say that from the sense that he's not a talented player. It's just he's already signed with Kansas State once. So we've kind of been expecting him to come back to Manhattan throughout this recruiting cycle. He ended up becoming, as a freshman, a first-team All-KJ CCC player in this talented region of junior colleges that Kansas State is so fortunate to be in the middle of. And so, Newton brings a little bit of a different dynamic than Robert Hentz. They both can get in the backfield in a hurry. They're both athletic linemen, both a little bit undersized, but I do think Hentz can be a little bit more of a run stopper, whereas Newton is, he is absolutely a pure pass rusher. And that's what they liked out of him out of Coffee High School back in the 2018 class. And so, like I said, they'll get 3 years for 3 out of him the second time around. And then the second guy that they were able to get on Tuesday evening was Kamari Gaines. He's a strong side defensive end from Hutchinson Community College. Another guy that we've kind of been forecasting would end up in Manhattan all along. They were able to get some late interest with him back in November, got an offer his way, and they've been the leader for him from the get-go. You know, Sam Pittman in Arkansas have tried to come in here late and really try and engage his interest late in the game. But I think what Kansas State was able to do and really develop a trust and show him that they do need somebody opposite of Wyatt Hubert immediately ready to go next year to spell Boone Massey. I think that was really tempting for Kamari Gaines, and I think he likes the idea of playing in the Big 12 where, you know, there's so many drop-back quarterbacks that he has a chance to, get in the backfield quite a bit.
Well, last night wasn't free of drama, as in Monday, and we've been following the T. Denson recruiting quite closely, and it was a little hairy for Kansas State, but they were able to remain a factor in Georgia, even though it's a new staff, and they've got 2 decorated corners. Tell us about the additions of T.J. Smith and Denson.
Yeah, I mean, with Joe Klanderman, Brian Anderson, and Buddy Wyatt, those 3 have kind of formed a tag team, if you will, to get into Georgia. And, of course, Van Malone and other position coaches have jumped in there when needed. But you look at primarily what Brian Anderson was able to do with those 2, and it's pretty remarkable because they're very talented players in their own right. You know, I think T.J. Smith was probably a little bit more under-heralded than T. Denson, primarily because of his stature at only 5'9". T. Denson is 6'1" and brings a little bit more length to the equation. So obviously, you know, college coaches were drawn to him a little bit more. But the thing that I like about both of these players, and T.J. Smith will play nickel, T. Denson will play more of the kind of a cover corner out on the boundary, but they come from immensely powerful, heralded Georgia football programs. And when I say that, that's saying that from the standpoint, of course, that Georgia is one of the most talent-rich recruiting states in the country. Cedar Grove has now won back-to-back state titles, and McEachern is, recognized every year as one of the state, if not one of the nation's best programs out of Powder Springs. So you look at both of those guys, and I think what I like best about them is they're just natural cover corners. Technique-wise, there's not a lot that Van Malone and Joe Klanderman are going to have to iron out. You know, it's going to be more getting them in a strength program, getting some extra weight so that they're able to bang around with some of the bigger receivers in the Big 12. But these are 2, honestly, of the better cover men that Kansas State has gotten out of the high school ranks in many, many years. This will be a class that you'll look back on as really being a foundation for the secondary and one that allows Van Malone and these guys to, you know, not play that type of defense that we became familiar with Bill Snyder, where guys are playing, 10 yards off the line of scrimmage. These are guys that they're going to be able to get right up on the line of scrimmage and press cover from snap first down to fourth down.
One of the positions we thought they would go the junior college route with was the offensive line, and to this point, at least, they only have 1 offensive lineman from the JUCO ranks, and boy, they looked at a number of guys. What do you know about Dawson Delforge, the 1 offensive lineman they have?
Well, he's versatile, and, the transition from Charlie Dickey to Connor Riley, if there's one thing that I think they both carry, it's this idea of recruiting linemen that are fluid, that you can move literally from one side to the other, and I think that's the type of lineman that they're going to get with Dawson Delforge. I think if they need him to be a tackle, I think you can slide him out there and do that because he is 6'5", about 315 pounds. But at Butler County, he was primarily an offensive guard. Where Connor Riley likes him is anyone's guess, and I don't know if we'll really know the answer until he arrives here and they get him going through spring ball, since he is an early enrollee for January. But, coming out of Wamego, he's a guy that has always liked the idea of coming home and playing for the local power in Kansas State. And so he's going to be a guy that obviously has cut his teeth a little bit in the JUCO market. I think it was obviously the best move for him to go from Wamego to junior college and now to Power 5, because I think he's prepared himself well. And so I think he's a type of player that can come in and be a factor. It's just kind of a shame that he's not a true tackle, because I do think that's kind of where they're hurting most for depth.
Yeah, I would agree. I'll be intrigued to see what this coaching staff does with that position. But when you talk recruiting, everyone wants to know about the quarterback. I'm included. I'm fascinated by Will Howard. How does he fit into this system? Because he might be the guy after one redshirt season that takes over for Skylar Thompson.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up Skylar Thompson. I think, going back and reviewing some of the quarterbacks that Kansas State has landed, Bill Snyder was notorious for having, at least one quarterback every class, which is smart when you think about it, because it is a position that you do see some kids that exit and, transfer early out of. So it's always nice to have, a kid for each class. But I think Will Howard might be the best passer that we've seen Kansas State land since Skylar Thompson, maybe even since Jake Waters. I think he is immensely accurate, can make just about every throw, and is surprisingly athletic for, being 6'4", 210 pounds and being primarily a pro-style quarterback. Obviously being from the area in Downingtown West in Downingtown, Pennsylvania, very close to the Philadelphia Eagles. And so he's going to remind some people, just like he did with Coach Klieman and Coach Messingham, of Carson Wentz. Maybe not quite that athletic, but from a build and a fundamentals and technique standpoint, you certainly see some of those similarities. And, Fitz, again, a talent-rich state like Pennsylvania, and Will Howard recently named the Southeast Pennsylvania Player of the Year, was doing things for Downingtown West that program has not done in many years, and he was the catalyst for it. He's the type of player that they wanted to get in at that position to allow Courtney Messingham to really do the things he wants to do on offense that we're starting to see under Skylar Thompson. I think Will Howard has the ability and certainly the potential to not only take over the reins from Skylar Thompson when Skylar's time in Manhattan is done, but maybe even build off of Skylar and exceed what we've seen Skylar be able to do in this offense.
If you're recruiting at Kansas State, the state of Kansas has to be a cornerstone. We know that. It's not going to change under this staff. As of now, there's 5 guys out of the high school ranks from Kansas in this class. What do you think of this group?
Yeah, they weren't able to land some of the most high-profile kids out of Kansas. And predominantly when I mention that, I'm talking about Turner Corcoran, Daniel Jackson, Kai Thomas, that end up at Minnesota and Nebraska. And so that was one of the minor kind of errors that I point out in signing day coverage for tomorrow, that, if there is something that you can kind of nitpick, it might be that they didn't land the best in Kansas, but they did land some really good players in a very deep year for Kansas. Nate Matlack is a guy that is wildly athletic, and they can develop him from a 6'4", 220-pound defensive end that can do everything to a 6'4", 240, 250-pound defensive end that can do everything. And I mean drop back and cover, rush the passer, be an anchor against run defense. He is as good of an athlete as we've seen in the defensive side come out of the Kansas City area and Olathe East, honestly, in quite some time. His testing numbers are through the roof. We'll test right up there with a guy like Jordan Willis. Taylor Warner, offensive guard, offensive tackle for Gardner Edgerton. Again, a big potential guy, just like Sam Shields and Hadley Panzer, fellow offensive linemen that Kansas State was able to land. Those are all guys that are going to benefit from redshirt seasons, guys that Chris Dawson is going to absolutely love, and they're going to be staples here in 2 or 3 years because they are aggressive, nasty, physical guys that are also very soft-spoken when you get them off the field. And then finally, Cody Stufflebean is a guy that, I've talked to analysts from outside the state of Kansas that think, if he was in another state, would have been sought after a lot more just because of the tools that he brings, both as a tight end or a defensive end. Another really, really athletic kid that, does it all from track, basketball, football. They're going to try him out at tight end first, and I think that he immediately brings an upgrade in athleticism from the players that we've seen at that position so far.
Yeah, I think he's got tight end written all over him. When I look at film of him, I'm like, this is the kind of big athlete they want at that position. And honestly, if you're a tight end or a guy that aspires to those things, this is eventually going to be a great system. I mean, they've shown that at North Dakota State. They love to throw the ball to the tight end, but you got to be the right guy. They're just not going to do it. A couple guys have been on the list for a while, one out of Texas, one out of Louisiana. We don't expect either of them to sign. Break those down.
You're looking at JoJo Wilson is the cornerback out of Houston at the prominent North Shore program, reigning state champions in Texas, and they'll be back in the state championship again this month. And he's one of their primary guys on defense, their lockdown cover man, 6'1", 180. And honestly, before the additions of T.J. Smith and T. Denson, might have been one of my favorite players in this class, and I still think he is. K-State sorely wants him. Van Malone and company are going to be riding him out throughout the course of the next month. But it's an academics thing. It's not that he's wavering on his pledge to K-State. He wants to be in Manhattan, but just needs to get some academic things corrected. Otherwise, I think we'll see him in the junior college ranks and not flipping to another school. The other player is McColden's son, Maxon, down in Louisiana. He's a wide receiver, but a guy that can play some defensive back, and I think that's where K-State would like to try him first. The story with Maxon, again, is not that he's wavering on his commitment to K-State. He's wanted to sign in February all along because he is a February baby. That is his birthday month. He wants his signing to, mean something, and so he's going to hold off, wait until February. And again, the coaches have been working him relentlessly since the day he committed. And it doesn't appear like he's going to be headed anywhere. But, in the last month, you can rest assured that Van Malone is going to be in his ear, just making sure that nobody else comes to try and pry him away.
According to our national staff of analysts at 24/7, Jeremiah Harris is an inside linebacker, is the elite player of this class. What can you tell me about him?
Immensely athletic. I've said that word a lot, but, Coach Klieman has preached from day one that he wants, big guys that are long and can run. Jeremiah Harris, he goes by Jay, isn't the longest guy, isn't the biggest guy, probably only about 6'1", maybe 205 pounds, but does have a frame that you can work with. But the thing they like about him is, again, just how quick he is. He's a relentless guy in his pursuit of the ball and, gets from point A to point B in a hurry. He can cover sideline to sideline as well as drop back and pass coverage. K-State was able to get him away from Oklahoma State, Arkansas, Missouri, and thankfully they were able to get in on him early because I think, playing for a program like Shadow Creek that, again, is back in the 5A state championships in Texas, they're a program that's under the limelight quite a bit. And so you could have seen his recruitment really blossom had Kansas State not gotten him committed in June. But they ended up getting him early. He loves the program, and he reminds me a lot of Eli Sullivan. That's the type of player that they're getting in Jay Harris, and a guy that could see the field a lot sooner than Eli did. He'll probably take a redshirt season unless he really comes in and blows up, but he should be ready to go in year two because they're going to need him.
What area do you feel like K-State hit a home run with in this class as you begin to preview what they need in the future?
Well, I think defensive backfield, in the secondary, they got a heck of a lot stronger, and really, you have guys like Wayne Jones back there already and guys like Lance Robinson that are also young that look like players that you can work with, and they were able to get Will Jones last year, and they like Logan Wilson. But I think as they've come to realize after a year in the Big 12 is you need more depth in the secondary. And so even though you have some of those younger players, it was, immensely important that they got more guys and got more talent, more pure cover players to attack those wide receivers that they see week in and week out. And so, again, to hopefully get Joseph Wilson, hopefully get Maxon in February, and then no matter what, still have T. Denson and T.J. Smith there at the nickel, that's going to be huge. And, of course, Malachi Mitchell at safety, too. I don't want to leave him out. But the other area that I think that they got a lot better at is tight end. Christian Moore is probably going to play more fullback, but he's a nasty guy that can play tight end as well. Will Swanson, and we already mentioned Cody Stufflebean. That was a position that other than Connor Fox, they really had nobody coming up the system, coming up the ranks, and so they got a lot better at tight end. And even though they didn't get an offensive tackle fit, these young offensive linemen that they got out of the high school ranks are guys that, again, I've said it before, the ceiling is extremely high for these players that, they're not guys that are going to be immediate impact players. And so I know fans are a little disappointed because Kansas State does need immediate impact guys on the offensive line. but they're players that the ceiling is incredibly high, and I think they're going to be guys that they build a foundation around for years to come.
How surprised are you that they didn't get a tackle, either out of the JUCO or high school ranks?
Very surprised.
Yeah, I'm too.
Carver Willis is a true tackle, but really that's it, out of the high school ranks. And really, really surprised they weren't able to get anybody from the junior college department. I think they would have gotten J.J. Crawford. From the sounds of it, they could have had him in the summer. But again, it's up to these kids to buckle down in the classroom, and sometimes they want to and sometimes they don't. And so you're seeing a guy like J.J. Crawford that will probably have to wait, isn't probably going to sign in December, is going to have to wait as a May graduate. And so maybe you can pick him up in February. Zeke Powell is a guy at Coffeyville that they really liked and really wanted. But again, academic flags rose up for him as well. So I'm surprised that they weren't able to, lock down somebody earlier and see that was going to be a need a lot, sooner than later in the fall. But to defend the recruiting staff and the staff that Chris Klieman has, they did identify guys early. They did get on guys that they felt like they could get and probably would have gotten, but sometimes the academics are out of their control. And so it's a shame that they weren't able to lock down somebody earlier. But again, the beautiful thing nowadays, Spitz, and it is a little dicey, is that wonderful thing called the transfer portal. And you can guarantee that offensive tackle will be a position that they're going to be looking at.
Yeah, you get a better picture of what you're getting, and you can just bring in someone and plug them in for a year and let them play. They worked at running back, and other schools I've seen have had great luck along the offensive line. We're going to take a little break now on this recruiting podcast brought to you by 24/7 Sports. And on the other side, we're going to get into some more big picture stuff with Ryan Wallace, our recruiting editor and analyst here at GoPowerCat.com. We're going to do another podcast on Wednesday, post-signing day press conference. We will have Hank Jacobs and Taylor Bratt in here in the WTC Gig Powered Studios to do some video and do some audio, and we will have a lot more information on recruiting in the written word and all kinds of stuff all over Go Powercat throughout Wednesday. But for now, let's take a little break, and we'll be right back on the other side with more of Ryan Wallace.
Stay locked in. The Powercat Podcast will be right back.
My days working, taking care of my little ones can be a lot. I checked out care.com and it was so easy for me to find local, experienced, and background check sitters. Finding our babysitter was way more affordable than I thought. Care.com makes it super easy. Search for qualified candidates. You can view their profiles, read reviews and ratings, check their availability, send messages directly, get the help that you need. Care.com should be every person's go-to.
Getting the crew together isn't as easy as it used to be. We get it. Life comes at you fast. But trust us, your pals are desperate for a good hang. And when they hear you stock the party with drinks from Drizzly, they'll be banging down your door. Let Drizzly, the go-to app for drink delivery, take care of the supplies. All you need is an excuse. It doesn't even have to be a good one. It's your dog's birthday. The loquats are finally ripe. Whatever. With Drizzly, you can compare prices on a massive selection of beer, wine, and spirits and get them delivered straight to your door. Which means you can entice the crew to leave their houses without ever leaving yours. Whatever the occasion, download the Drizzly app or go to drizzly.com. That's DRIZLY.com today. Must be 21 plus, not available in all locations.
We now send it back to Fitz in the WTC Gig Powered Studios.
Welcome back to this special recruiting podcast, a recruiting Powercat podcast brought to you by 24/7 Sports. We are affiliates on the network, and boy, do we love it. Gabe Brooks, our kind of contact with the national recruiting staff, always does a good job covering Kansas State for us, particularly out of the Texas, Louisiana region. Wally, let's continue now with some questions, not as much about this class specifically, but maybe big picture things. We just talked about tackle in the last section. Is there another area that maybe they just missed on with this class?
I think to some extent, maybe you could make an argument for running back, just because you do lose James Gilbert. You do lose Jordan Brown. It seemed like there at the end of the year, maybe they were a little bit reluctant to make Harry Trotter more of a presence. So will they make him the staple next season? I don't know. And again, you get to rest easy a little bit knowing that Joe Irvin had the type of freshman year that he did. Jacardia Wright is still there. And there were even guys that we didn't get to see this year in C.J. Price and Thomas Grayson. So I would say instead of running back, because they were able to get, an all-purpose guy in Deuce Vaughn, Keon Mosey can do a little bit out of the backfield as well, even though both of those players could see some time in the slot. I think receiver was a spot for me personally that I wish they would have hit a little bit harder in this class. I realized that numbers-wise, pretty much you're only losing Dalton Schoen from that group. Heading into next year, you still have Malik Knowles, you still have Sebastian Taylor, you still have Josh Youngblood and Keenan Garber coming up. I get it. But if you're only going to use one scholarship for a wide receiver in this class, I was surprised that they went ahead and took Jalen Travis. No knock on Travis, because I do feel like he has the tools to develop, but they needed a bigger weapon. They needed a guy that I think can stretch the field a little bit more than Travis can. And quite frankly, I just don't think they were able to do that. So for me personally, I really would have liked to have seen them maybe go get another wide receiver to complement Travis, or maybe just wait a little bit, see if there was anybody else that they could get that was, maybe fit this scheme, fit what they need vertically a little bit more than Travis. And if they couldn't, then maybe see if they can come back and get the Mansfield Summit wide receiver a little bit later.
Okay, we're officially past the 1-year mark with Chris Klieman at Kansas State. He was in charge of recruiting at this time last year. But I don't know about you, but for me, it's been a big transition from the recruiting style of the Klieman program as opposed to the Bill Snyder program. What jumps out at you as the difference and maybe similarities in the two?
As far as the differences go, obviously there's, everything that we see, the social media presence, these graphic edits that the Kansas State is sending out that the players are posting all over their social media platforms. But you'll be able to read, and many, not all, but many of the profiles as kids sign tomorrow, you'll be able to read some quotes from various signees, and you'd be surprised how many of them mention and what sold them on K-State or a memorable moment from their recruitment. How many of them mention the name Chris Klieman and a conversation they had with Chris Klieman that stands out, and how impactful that was in them choosing Kansas State and the lasting memory that left. You never really heard that with Bill Snyder. You did when he would bring kids in on official visits, but quite often it wasn't a conversation that was memorable. And that's no knock on Coach Snyder. He was just more of an old school guy that preferred to talk about, your academics and your family life. And I do think Chris Klieman touches on a lot of those things too. But the way that his delivery just seems to hit home with a lot of these younger players. And he is just the type of guy that I think you were able to sit down with him, and you've seen him in person deliver, command of a room. And I think he does that when he's speaking one-on-one to these recruits. So from that standpoint, I think they're very different. Coach Klieman is out on the trail and in person with a lot of these prospects. Similarity-wise, I think they're very similar in the way that they evaluate. They throw stars out. I think they look at players that, are hungry, that are a little under-recruited, that do have a desire to get better and want to be coached, and guys that have an upside. Coach Snyder was great at finding diamonds in the rough. I think there are a few in this class, littered throughout from top to bottom, guys that Chris Klieman and his staff were able to evaluate and, see some potential in, ignore some of these minor question marks and flaws, and just ride with it. Some of them work out, some of them don't. But I think we'll learn to trust this staff and their evaluations just as we did Coach Snyder's.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, and this was the thing that kind of struck me, is their ability to get out there and secure so many early commitments. I mean, before the season even started, they had, some of the most commitments of any program in the Big 12. It has prevented them from being in scramble mode at this time of year. And it always seems like whether the signing day was December or February, we'd go into a scramble mode with Bill Snyder's recruiting as they try to fill the holes frantically at the end before they lose other players. And that hasn't been necessary this time.
No, 100% true. Can't tell you how many times we would go into January with Coach Snyder, and because his staff would have to go dormant through the season and primarily keep so much of their focus on what was happening within the Veneer complex, they would lose sight of a lot of recruits that by the end of summer they had really gotten in on, and then those prospects were interested, and then things would go quiet and they'd lose them in the fall. And so, they would come back in December and furiously try and set up visits for literally the last weekend before, National Signing Day in February, trying to get, pieces together. And some of those pieces would work, but many of them didn't. And so what we saw with Coach Klieman and company was a carryover from what they did so often at North Dakota State. They put heavy emphasis on getting kids in for junior days. Those kids that immediately struck them in evaluations, they were in on more than one junior day weekend. I think we had close to 3 or 4 junior day weekends roughly this time last year, here in a couple months. And then they really emphasized their camp circuit. If you were invited to a K-State camp this year by Coach Klieman, it was a serious invitation. And really a sincere tryout for them, because you look at some of the guys that ended up committing to this program. Jalen Travis earned his offer at a camp visit. Hadley Panzer earned his offer at a camp visit. Cody Stuffelbein earned his offer at a camp visit. Will Swanson. All of these kids were able to impress at camp visits, and that was another thing that really stood out to me was, again, camp wasn't so much this year to, just make relationships with guys, or it wasn't for, as it was with Coach Snyder sometimes, a chance for him to see how his assistant coaches could coach and kind of teach them how to coach for the fall. It was legitimately, we are here to recruit. And they were able to hit home runs with a lot of kids. And I think we'll see that those camps will become more and more important, the longer Chris Klieman is in Manhattan. He definitely used those 2 or 3 weekends in June to his advantage this class.
One of the things that jumped out at me is when we knew that Chris Klieman was going to be the guy, you immediately start talking about recruiting, and they had so much luck in that upper Midwest region, Minnesota and Illinois, of course the Dakotas and Nebraska. Yeah, there's a Nebraska guy here and there, and but for the most part, this is rooted in exactly what K-State football has been rooted in. Granted, there's a quarterback out of Pennsylvania, which is totally out of left field, but you see guys from the Sunflower State and a whole bunch of guys from Texas. And they did a pretty good job in Texas, didn't they?
Absolutely. I mean, that's where the majority of this class is. You take away the 6 from Kansas, and the next 2 highest states as far as the number of commits that Kansas State is going to end up signing as long as this class holds together. You're looking at 7 players from Texas and then 3 from Georgia. And then you add in California, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, as far as, the junior college ranks go. So Fitz, going back and reflecting, that was one of probably the only concern that I had with the hiring of Chris Klieman right out of the gate was just, can he prove himself to be a recruiter? And not, like you said, going up into, getting the best player in South Dakota, or, you can't make a living in Nebraska picking off the Cornhuskers leftovers. You have to be a staple in Texas. You have to be a staple in some of these more talent-rich recruiting areas. And Chris Klieman has said, you know what, I'm going to do that. And he has, and he's proven himself. And the scary thing is that this is still a staff that, and a lot of those kids in Texas and Georgia or Florida, isn't a staple yet there. And so it's scary to think what this staff can do with, a stronger pedigree and a stronger resume after a couple years in the Big 12, what they can do. So absolutely. And it goes without saying the importance of Van Malone. Because what he did in Texas, the majority of those commits and future signees, I should say, in Texas, he had his fingerprint on. Jeremiah Harris, Houston, that's Van Malone's territory. Joseph Wilson, Houston. You look at Ronald Triplett, Houston. And then, on top of that, you look at the kids out of Georgia, we're all, the cornerbacks, which is his position. So, of course, he had, his hands in on those recruitments to a certain degree as well. So it goes without saying the history that man has in Texas and why his hiring was so important. You're reaping the benefits of it now here at early signing period.
We talked about the Sunflower State in the first portion of this podcast, 5 guys out of the state. Did they do a good job considering these relationships? It almost feels like they got beat to the punch on some of these guys with coaches that had set up shop prior to Chris Klieman, maybe just a year or two in advance. And also, what's coming down the road? What's the state of Kansas look like in the future for the staff?
Yeah, it was a little tough, and I think Coach Klieman sort of alluded to that a little bit early on, and when he said that they were kind of behind the 8 ball a little bit as far as 2020 commits go. And that's why it's really hard to, for as much as we want to applaud what they were able to do with this group of signings, I think 2021 will be a little bit more telling about what this coaching staff can do, not only in Kansas, but outside of Kansas, because those will be players that they will have had a chance to develop relationships with now for at least a year, if not more, for a lot of the local kids. So, it's hard to really beat them up for losing Turner Corcoran or losing Kai Thomas, because, again, they were forming relationships when a lot of other programs had already been on those targets for, well over a year. But you talked about the 2021 class in Kansas. It's definitely not as loaded top to bottom, and it isn't going to be as top heavy. But I do think that there are probably 3 players in my eyes that would stand the test in any class year in Kansas. I think personally Devin Neal out of Lawrence is going to wind up being the number 1 player in the state. I was able to see him go against Kai Thomas in the state playoffs this year, and he is absolutely dynamic. Running back from Lawrence High School, about 5'11", 6 feet tall, and probably by the time his senior year comes around will be pushing, that 190, 200-pound threshold, and he is an all-purpose back that can be a receiver. He can run between the tackles, outside the tackles, and run away from you. Very good player. I think Arlen Bruce, another running back at Olathe North, the reigning Simone Award winner. He was just crowned recently. A really dynamic player, better athlete than I think people give him credit for, because he could end up becoming, a defensive back, a safety in a lot of colleges' eyes. I wonder why maybe Kansas State hasn't offered yet. Maybe they're prioritizing Devin Neal, who does have an offer. But I bet you Arlen Bruce, the 4th, will have an offer here soon. And another guy that, in my mind, I think stands the test there is Philippe Wesley out of Bishop Miege. K-State is targeting him. He's got a lot more national interest. Kind of did a little bit of a national recruiting tour this year in the offseason, so a lot of more colleges know about him. And so maybe Kansas State doesn't end up with him, but they kind of have their butts covered because they ended up going out and getting a receiver that might have bigger potential than Philip Wesley, and that's Dorian Stevens, 6'3", 185 pounds out of Blue Valley High School, my alma mater. So I've been able to get to know Dorian rather well and watch him play a number of times. I think when you get him in a system that is a little bit, more defined, as Kansas State will, and kind of define his role a little bit, and bulk him up, preached it for him to be a little bit more physical. Wow, you see him in pads, man, he certainly passes the eye test. And, getting hand locked down early on was huge for the state of Kansas. And I think that, he's the type of player that can really stretch the field and the guy that they need heading into the future at a wide receiver position.
Are they mostly done with this? I know there's a couple guys that they hope will sign late. Is there any storylines fans should be following as we cover it at Go Powercat here leading up to the late period once this one closes? Or if the coaches pretty much said, you know what, we'll look at the portal. We'll go peek at that. Someone pops up, we'll take a look. But we're turning our attention to 21 and 22 and trying to build those relationships better that some coaches had when we arrived here in Manhattan.
Yeah, I think it, might come as a disappointment to some who are used to, again, that kind of January surge, even with, the early signing period. Because, again, if you remember back to last year, a guy like Joshua Youngblood didn't really arrive on the scene for Kansas State recruiting until late December, early January. And so I think there are some fans out there that might be a little naive and hoping that this isn't done, that kind of want to live, have the 2020 cycle live on. I don't think that's going to be the case. You mentioned it earlier, Fitz, in the last segment. We're already looking at 24 commitments on signing day eve. Like you mentioned, they might be able to push some of those guys back and not count. So they might actually have a little bit more room than just having, one more scholarship left to give. They might have, maybe 2, 3 in the back pocket, but you absolutely can assure that the transfer portal is going to be a place that they look. So they're going to have one in their back pocket there. And, they might sign 1 or 2 more guys on Wednesday, whether it's, Whit Mitchum, the offensive tackle, high school from McKenzie, Tennessee, that was on a visit recently, whether it's Justin Gardner, a Hutchinson Community College defensive back, teammate of Kamari Gaines. I know he's announcing tomorrow. He's still kind of on the radar. They might use a scholarship towards those 2 guys and just call it quits. They might not. Either way, I think the point I'm trying to make is it is going to be a very, 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 very quiet January from a 2020 standpoint. And it goes back to what I was just talking about with 2021. That is a class that this staff has been kind of eyeballing all along, even throughout the 2020 cycle. They've made it apparent they want to get in early on kids. And so I think the more time they can dedicate in January and February to next year's recruiting class, I think that's the way they would prefer it. And so as much as they can kind of have their hands clean post tomorrow, the better. That's the way that they want this to all work out.
Chris Klieman's recruiting press conference is at 3 tomorrow. We will convene around 5 in this room and cover it again, and we'll see what tomorrow brings. Do you expect any surprises, or would they be surprises if you expect them?
No, like I said, I think really the only 2 guys that Kansas State's really kind of waiting on at this point would be Whit Mitchum, the offensive tackle out of Tennessee, and maybe Justin Gardner, the defensive back out of Hutchinson Community College. Other than that, it might be a surprise if JoJo Wilson signs, might be a surprise if Max Son signs. That would be pleasant news because we're crossing our fingers that those guys sign in February, but if they are able to sign tomorrow, that just means that they were able to get their academics together a little sooner than we thought. But, other than those kind of scenarios playing out, I think what you're seeing here on Tuesday night is pretty much the way it is going to appear on Wednesday.
His name's Ryan Wallace. He's our recruiting editor, our key analyst in covering Kansas State football. He's done it for years, and he's the best in the business. He doesn't report noise. He reports news. If he's reporting it, you can count on it. It comes from good sources. Wally, thank you very much. Well, it's a wrap for this recruiting podcast. As I mentioned, we will talk to you again on Wednesday right here from the WTC Gig Powered Studios.
You've been listening to the Powercat Recruiting Podcast, presented by 24/7 Sports. Powercat Podcast. All rights reserved. GoPowercat.com and Spirit Street Publishing.
With Blue Link Plus, you can access your Hyundai Tucson Limited remotely. Doors unlocked, temperature set, lost car found.
There it is.
Get complimentary class-leading Blue Link Plus. Call 562-314-4603 for complete details.